last but not least, we've got Kai Johns joining from Greenbank's Ethical, Sustainable and Impact Research team. So he's going to be giving us an update on kind of really how Greenbank tease apart some of these complex issues, how we weave them into our investment and engagement activity. So Kai, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Kate. So, water under pressure, investing in water. So, as Kate said, I'm going to address how we at Greenbank think about the issue of water and how it's a really important issue that actually underpins a range of other sustainability issues. As Nick talks about in his speech, a systems thinking approach is really key, and that's what we're going to go on to at the end. So to start with, why are we here today? Well, there are 9 planetary boundaries. 9 boundaries which, if we cross, we're at risk of irreversible change. In 2023, the Stockholm Resilience Institute updated their research. And in that year, we crossed the freshwater change boundary for the first time. For all the reasons we've heard of so far today, that threshold has now been crossed. So just to put it into a bit of context from a supply and demand perspective. We've heard about rising population. You know, water is a finite resource. So when we add more and more people, as this dotted line continues to grow up, then the water available per person decreases, and that's adding to the stress that we see. The second point, urbanisation. So when I started looking at water, I presumed that people living in cities would make water more efficient. You know, you can have lots of people in one place, you can directly flow it to the people. But actually, as we heard with Genuine, that's not the case. It brings around a load of other challenges, and the concrete environment is one of them. So that's another thing that's driving up demand on water. The third factor on demand, the emerging middle class. So the richer, the wealthier that people get, the more that they consume. And as we'll see a bit later on, the water content associated with consumption is high. So there you've got 3 reasons that are really driving water demand upwards. And then on the other hand, you've got 2 factors that are negatively affecting supply. So climate change. We heard earlier about how water patterns are changing, how in times you're getting droughts, in times you're getting floods. This is affecting supply. And then pollution. As water pollution increases, the quality of water decreases, and the availability of clean water supply goes down. So how does that translate into numbers? What's that supply-demand dynamic? So in 2005, the World Economic Forum ran some research to try and project what level of water supply gap we'd have by 2030. And their forecast was 40%. Last year, those figures were ran again, and their forecast was 40%. So what does that tell us? Well, we've not made much progress since 2005. So as investors, how can we approach this issue? There are 3 sort of ways that we could think about investing directly in water, and they're on the slide now. So the first is water utilities. So the Thames Waters of this world, the companies going out and supplying our water. The second is the infrastructure, the Genuits, the piping. And then the third is water technology companies. Now this third category I think is quite interesting because they are what you could call a sort of win-win-win company. So the first being their products help their customers save money. the second being the products help the environment, and then third, they take a little bit for themselves. So what I'm going to do now is just talk through a couple of example companies operating in that third area. So Xylem. Xylem is a US water technology company. On the slide, we've got two of its products. The one on the left is its View software platform. So what it does is it enables water utilities to see a real-time feed of their operations. And in doing so, they can monitor performance, they can do predictive maintenance, and try and reduce some of those supply issues they might have otherwise had. And on the right, we have a water meter. Now, I moved flats a couple of weeks ago. I moved in and I needed to find my water meter. And I couldn't. Now, I could find my energy meter. That was nice and easy. That was in the cupboard. And after doing a little bit of research into it, that's pretty common. So this figure is for the US, but energy meter penetration is at 90% for an advanced meter, and for water meters, it's at 30%. So what we're seeing is water being overlooked a little bit compared to other key resources. The second example company I wanted to talk through was Halma. So Halma is a UK company that owns about 50 smaller companies across a range of industries, one of which is environmental analysis. So on the left, you've got one of their portable water quality kits. So you can use that to go out and test water in rivers and local environments. And that goes back to the water quality angle we were talking about earlier. The other thing that Halma do that I think is really interesting is addressing the problem of leaks that Nick touched on so clearly. The stat that I've got is that something like a fifth of water globally is lost to leakage within pipes. So one of the tools that Halma sell are cameras, micro cameras, little robots that go into the pipes, can identify using AI where the little leaks are, and the micro leaks do stack up. And then using their robots and their equipment, you can start to fix those leaks. So they're the sorts of companies that we've seen in the past. But what about the future? What are the future water direct solutions looking like? Desalination has been touched on quite a lot. One thing that hasn't been touched on and is a real problem there is what do you do with the salt? So you get the seawater, you desalinate it, and you have all of this excess salt. If you put it directly back into the sea, that very much negatively impacts on the local marine biodiversity. So you've got all of this salt, what do you do with it? Now in Argentina, brine and bright sort of direct extraction is quite a key way that we globally produce lithium. So there are many companies, often quite early stage, that on the desalination point are looking at how can we make the most of the outputs and really taking a circular mindset to it. The next is atmospheric generation, and this is very early stage in some ways. So this is where you condense water or pressurize water that's in the environment and use that as another form of supply. Now I say it's very early stage in some ways. It was actually used by the Incas many years ago as their primary source of drinking water. So both of those are sort of on the supply part of that supply-demand dynamic. And then the other is drought-resistant crops. So if we can modify crops such that they need less water to produce, then we can reduce demand from agriculture. But it's not just all about those direct water investments. The impacts of water affect broader economy. And this is some really interesting research from Roland Berger, and what they're trying to do is to map across from reduced water availability into increased costs for companies. So this is very much about the transmission mechanism, how water can affect companies. So quality decreasing, water quantity available decreasing, having to go further for your water, all of these things will cost companies more over time. And which industries are affected the most? So we've heard quite a bit about agriculture. We've heard something earlier about semiconductors, which I think is a really, really interesting area that we'll go into in a second. But also textiles. And on the charts here, the dark green is the volume of effect. So you can see that agriculture, textile, paper and pulp, they're the ones that are going to be affected the most by the water scarcity situation. Now, water cuts across a range of sustainability issues. And the one that we've heard about today in quite a bit of detail from Genuit is climate adaptation. That need for increased resilience as water patterns change, as rainfall increases in certain areas in these dark blue and decreases in the orange. I won't touch any more on that because we've heard such a good overview already. The second area I wanted to talk about is technology. So we heard earlier about semiconductors and the situation in Taiwan and how much water is needed to produce a chip. But what about when they're being used? So in the last years, in particular, we've seen a real development of data centers, big rollout. Now, as these chips are getting more powerful, more complicated, they're getting hotter. And so what you need is a way of cooling it down. And traditionally, there are two ways of doing that. Number one, blowing cool air on it, and number two, using water to cool it. Now, the company on the right here is Belimo, and they make valves that allow you to control the flow of water for cooling, and in doing so, make that process much more efficient. Now, investing in companies isn't the only way that we as Greenbank, we as investors can make a change within the water theme. The other is through an active programme of engagement. And on the right here, we've got the 3 priority areas for this year. And each of them affects water in some way. So nature, we were talking about biodiversity shortly. Climate, we've been talking about adaptation, and then the mitigation piece with Belimo, and then health. Water is a key part of agriculture, which is a key part of nutrition, and also, of course, hydration is quite handy for health. So on biodiversity, how does water interact with biodiversity? So when we're thinking about biodiversity data, on land, it's not great. In aquatic biodiversity systems, it's even poorer. So how do we approach that challenge as investors? And we heard earlier about how the lack of data can be a real problem. Well, we can use the drivers of biodiversity loss as a proxy for actual biodiversity loss. And here I've taken some guidance from the Science Based Targets for Nature organisation, and you can see all these 1s and 2s. So this is a chart saying how much does water affect biodiversity in these industries. 1s and 2s show that answer is very much. And then finally, we've heard about how water is related to climate adaptation and mitigation and biodiversity, but it is also a key resource in its own right. And I wanted to share a stat that alarmed me and surprised me initially when I read it. So the typical fast fashion cotton t-shirt takes 2,700 litres of water, which is a staggering amount. And that's enough water that you or I could drink in 2.5 years, just for one t-shirt. So an example of a company working in the textiles industry, which, if we go back, was one of the most impacted industries, is Coats Group. Now, they've got a two-pronged strategy for dealing with water within their business. The first is exemplified by these targets at the bottom here, so focusing on efficiency and water recycling and making the most. And then the second that runs parallel to that, so they have these two programs at the same time, is investing in water-free dyeing, water-free thread dyeing. So recently they released their first product, the EcoStru shoe, which didn't require any water. And that's one way that they're trying to innovate out of being so impactful on water. So to conclude, water is a key sustainability issue. It cuts across all of the main topics that we're focused on climate, of nature, and it is a key resource in its own right.